Today, I'm going to tell you a story about something extremely incomprehensible in America. You might ask, who would entrust their newborn child to a complete stranger? But this stranger would say, "Give me your child. I'll use my methods to make him a future social elite." So, I ask you, would you be willing to do this? Nobody would. That's pointless, isn't it? It's impossible to entrust your child to you. But I'm telling you, there really was such a person in America. A notorious behaviorist psychologist. This guy was constantly trying to persuade people to do this. This psychologist was incredibly persuasive, frequently claiming in the media that if you gave him a baby, he could randomly pick one with his eyes closed and train it to become any kind of person, including doctor, lawyer, businessman, beggar, thief, thug, president, anything. So why did this guy spout such nonsense? What are his abilities? Let me tell you. First, in his eyes, a child's talent, inclinations, abilities, and genes are completely unimportant because he believes everything can be controlled through nurture. Furthermore, in nurture and education, especially in infancy, emotions absolutely cannot be used in guiding and educating a child. Education must be completely detached from emotional factors and based on objectivity. Only then can he raise the so-called successful child. So, who is this person? Who is so twisted as to utter such slogans? Let me tell you, this person's name is John Dewey Watson, or John Watson in Chinese. Does the name John Watson sound familiar? Actually, many media outlets reported on this at the time because initially, John Watson wasn't like what I just described, not so twisted from the start, not spouting so many theories about people. He had his own set of insights into child education, which essentially fooled the American public, including the media and government. However, as time went on, people gradually realized something was amiss. They discovered he was a madman, a fanatic, and began to peel back the layers of his facade, and so it went. Slowly, many of John Watson's experiments were clarified, and people finally understood that he was a psychopath. Which of his experiments was the most famous? Undoubtedly, it was the infamous Little Albert experiment. So what exactly was the Little Albert experiment? What was the Little Albert experiment? It was essentially John Watson's attempt to warn the world that fear is not innate, but rather cultivated. In 1920, American psychologist John Watson and his assistant, Rayna, conducted an experiment on fear using a 9-month-old infant at Johns Hopkins University. The baby's name was Albert, but because he was so young, he was simply called Little Albert. Thus, the Little Albert experiment was born. So what exactly was this experiment like? Why is it considered cruel and unknown? Let me tell you. In the first step of the experiment, John Watson exposed Little Albert to things he had never seen before, such as burning flames, lively monkeys, docile dogs, furry rabbits, and even some disgusting rats. They discovered that the child wasn't afraid of these things at all. He just touched them without hesitation. In other words, this established the conclusion that the child was born without the ability to feel fear. Watson, seeing this, thought, "Oh dear. It seems that Little Albert is truly born without the ability to feel fear," and so he began the second step of the experiment. But this second step was far more distorted than the first. The second step of the experiment stemmed from Watson's discovery of young Albert in the first film. After seeing all the unfamiliar things, Albert's favorite was the little mouse. So, Watson placed Albert with his 2 favorite mice. Initially, Albert still showed great interest in the mice, playing with them. However, every time Watson was about to touch a mouse, he would become agitated, striking a bell with a hammer. Since Watson had confined Albert and the mice in a sealed space, the ringing of the bell was extremely jarring to a human ear, causing Albert's strong reaction. Every time he heard the bell, Albert would cry loudly. This repeated cycle. Every time Albert touched a mouse, Watson would ring the bell. Over time, this would create a psychological trauma for the child. He would perceive mice as dangerous and never touch them again. Therefore, Watson began the third step of his experiment. The experiment continued, keeping Albert in the same mouse box. However, instead of ringing the bell, Watson simply stopped when the mouse was about to touch Albert. Albert cried. What did John Watson prove in this experiment? He proved that people's emotions can be controlled by conditioned reflexes. Initially, Albert was indifferent to the sight of the mouse, but the accompanying loud, piercing noise gradually instilled in him a fear of mice. Therefore, from then on, Albert would cry whenever he saw a mouse. Watson was very satisfied with his experiment, feeling he had proven something to the world. Watson also gained considerable fame in the psychology community at the time. However, over the years, until 2009, some academics came forward to say that Watson's experiment was utterly inhumane. This experiment is absolutely wrong, because some related reports in 2009 indicated that some people claimed little Albert died of cerebral edema at the age of 6. In other words, Watson caused great harm to little Albert when he was young. However, later, in 2014, other scholars came forward to say that this was incorrect. The claim in 2009 that Albert died of cerebral edema at age 6 was unfounded, as we have investigated. We found little Albert's family and descendants. Albert lived until 2007, when he died at the age of 87. However, the 2014 reports also stated that although Albert's death at 87 was confirmed, before his death at 87, Albert's family consistently claimed that Albert could not tolerate anything with fur throughout his life. For example, pet dogs and cats, and even plush toys, could not be near Albert. Albert was extremely averse to these things. Just then, an American developmental psychologist named Mary Jones stepped forward. She said, "Stop discussing this. John Watson's experiment, from a medical research perspective, was indeed a significant breakthrough for psychological research, proving that it seems all fear is caused by conditioned reflexes. But I have my own experimental report. My experimental report did not use Watson's inhumane experimental methods. I have spent my life summarizing an experimental report. And the result? After everyone reviewed Mary Jones's experimental report, everyone was shocked, because Mary Jones's experimental report ultimately told people, just as John Watson did, human fear is caused by reflexes. However, Mary Watson's experimental methods were completely in accordance with human ethical standards. Therefore, the American Psychological Association immediately issued ethical standards for experiments, prohibiting anyone from conducting unethical scientific experiments. Because science is the driving force of social progress, but ethics and morality are the bottom line of social development, only scientific research that adheres to ethical standards can succeed. That's the real ladder that drives social progress. And what about you, friends? We categorize John Watson's experiment on Albert as a horrific experiment, and I think we haven't wronged him at all. Okay friends, that's all for this episode. After listening, don't forget to follow me. But this follow isn't for nothing. You can only see my profile picture if you follow me. And when you click on my profile picture, you'll find, wow, my goodness. This host account has so many similar programs sharing folk ghost stories and listeners' ghost tales, so you definitely won't regret it. If this episode isn't enough, you can quickly listen to my other programs. And every night, there's no need to say goodbye, because later you can listen to my late night chat room, the Ghost Archive, and the Shocking Files. We'll meet again in those programs. Ha ha ha. Alright, that's all for today's top secret file. See you later, everyone.